The funeral director's office smelled like artificial pine and hushed disappointment. Across from me sat my stepbrother Marcus, adjusting his designer tie with the same precision he used to calculate his real estate commissions. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man with practiced sympathy, cleared his throat before delivering the news that would shatter what remained of my relationship with this family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Your mother left very specific instructions about the military honors, he said, his voice careful and measured. She requested that any ceremonial aspects be kept minimal to avoid drawing unwanted attention to certain family circumstances. The words hit me like shrapnel. Even in death, my mother was trying to hide me, to minimize the very thing that had defined my entire adult life. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "You have to understand," he said, addressing the funeral director, but clearly performing for my benefit. "Our family has always valued discretion. Some of us have built our reputations on being upstanding members of the community. We can't have any spectacles that might reflect poorly on the family name." His eyes met mine with the cold calculation I'd grown to recognize over the years, especially with her military situation being so complicated. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, while inside I felt the familiar burn of being reduced to an embarrassment, a problem to be managed. This wasn't just about funeral arrangements. This was about 20 years of being treated like a disappointment by people who had never bothered to understand what I actually did for a living. To understand how that moment in the funeral director's office became the catalyst for everything that followed, you have to understand the two completely different versions of me that existed in two completely different worlds. In my family's eyes, I was Captain Sarah Chen, the daughter who chose a career that took her away from home, who missed family gatherings for deployments they couldn't pronounce the names of, and who had somehow failed to live up to the potential they thought I'd wasted on military service. But 3,000 miles away, in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon, I was Colonel Sarah Chen, and my voice could change the course of international policy with a single recommendation. The dichotomy was so complete, so jarring, that sometimes I felt like I was living two entirely separate lives in parallel universes. The morning before my mother's funeral, I stood in that Pentagon briefing room addressing a collection of generals, defense officials, and intelligence personnel whose combined years of service could span centuries. The room was stark and utilitarian, all clean lines and the soft hum of sophisticated electronics. A massive screen displayed satellite imagery from the South China Sea, where tensions had been escalating for months. "The latest intelligence suggests a significant escalation in aggressive posturing," I stated, my laser pointer tracing the movement patterns we'd identified. "Our assessment indicates a 73% probability of provocative action within the next 96 hours. I paused, scanning the faces of some of the most powerful military leaders in the country, all of them listening to my every word with the intense focus that life and death decisions require. "I recommend we implement Protocol 7 immediately," I continued, clicking to the next slide that outlined a complex diplomatic and military response strategy I'd spent weeks developing. "This will position our assets for maximum deterrent effect while maintaining plausible defensive posture." The room was silent, except for the scratch of pens on classified notepads and the occasional murmur of approval. When I finished, a four-star general nodded gravely and said, "Excellent analysis, Colonel. We'll brief the Joint Chiefs within the hour." In that room, my expertise wasn't questioned, my judgment wasn't second-guessed. When I spoke, people listened because they knew that my assessments could prevent wars or, when necessary, help win them. I was trusted with secrets that could destabilize governments and relied upon to make recommendations that would affect the lives of millions. My colleagues didn't see me as someone who had failed to live up to expectations. They saw me as someone whose success was measured in conflicts prevented and American lives saved. But the moment I left that briefing room and boarded a plane back to Sacramento for my mother's funeral, I transformed back into the version of myself my family had created. The disappointing daughter who had chosen duty over family dinners, service over settling down, and a career they couldn't understand over a life they could boast about at their country club gatherings. The transformation was so complete that by the time I walked into my childhood home, I could feel myself becoming smaller, quieter, more defensive. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, all tasteful beiges and carefully curated family photos that told a very selective story. My stepfather Robert was in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his successful accounting practice, while Marcus held court in the living room, regaling visiting relatives with stories of his latest real estate triumph. "Sarah, you made it," my Aunt Linda said when she saw me, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for family members who are present but not entirely welcome. "We weren't sure you'd be able to get leave." I could hear the unspoken criticism in her words, the suggestion that military service was somehow a choice I made to avoid family responsibilities rather than a calling I dedicated my life to. Marcus looked up from his conversation, his expression shifting to what I'd learned to recognize as his performance of familial concern. "It's good you're here, Sarah. Mom worried about you, you know. All those dangerous places you went to. She never understood why you couldn't find something safer, something closer to home." His words were poison wrapped in apparent care, designed to make me feel guilty for choices that had literally helped protect his comfortable suburban existence. I nodded and smiled, falling back into the familiar pattern of absorbing their disapproval without response. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to learn, was that those dangerous places Marcus referenced included coordinating humanitarian aid distribution in refugee camps, working with international partners to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction, and developing strategies that had successfully deterred multiple potential conflicts. But in their minds, my career was just an extended rebellion against their expectations. The evening before the funeral, we gathered in the formal dining room for what Marcus called a planning meeting, but what felt more like a tribunal.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The table was set with my mother's best china, a detail that seemed absurdly formal for the character assassination that was about to unfold. Robert sat at the head of the table, assuming the patriarchal authority he'd never quite earned, while Marcus distributed printed agendas as if we were corporate board members rather than grieving family. "We need to discuss the service," Marcus began, his tone businesslike and cold. "There are certain realities we need to address about how this family is perceived in the community." He glanced at me briefly, then looked away, as if my presence was something embarrassing he had to acknowledge but preferred not to focus on. "Mom built a reputation over 40 years as a pillar of this community. We owe it to her memory to ensure that reputation remains intact." I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach, the one that always appeared when I sensed they were building up to something particularly hurtful. "What exactly are you concerned about?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral despite the growing tension I felt. Linda cleared her throat delicately, the way she always did before delivering what she considered difficult truths. "Well, dear, it's just that your military situation has always been a bit complicated for people to understand. All those foreign deployments, the secretive nature of your work. People in our social circle, they have questions." The word situation hung in the air like an accusation. My military situation wasn't complicated. I was a decorated colonel with 20 years of distinguished service, multiple commendations, and a security clearance that allowed me access to some of the most sensitive intelligence in the world. But to them, my career was a situation, a problem that reflected poorly on their standing in a community that measured success by how well your children conformed to their narrow definitions of achievement. Marcus leaned forward, assuming the role of family spokesman with obvious relish. "What we're saying is that it might be better if we kept things simple tomorrow. A quiet service, minimal military references. We don't want people getting the wrong idea about what kind of family we are." His words were carefully chosen, designed to sound reasonable while delivering a message that was anything but. I stared at him across the table, this man who had never risked anything more dangerous than a contentious real estate negotiation, telling me that my 2 decades of service to country needed to be hidden to protect his reputation. The irony was so thick I could taste it. While I had been deployed to some of the world's most dangerous regions, working to prevent conflicts that could have threatened the very lifestyle he enjoyed, he had been building a comfortable existence based on the peace and prosperity that people like me helped secure. "What kind of family are you worried about appearing to be?" I asked, my voice still level but with an edge that made Robert shift uncomfortably in his chair. "A respectable one," Marcus replied without hesitation. "One that raises children who contribute to their community in conventional, understandable ways. One that doesn't need to explain why their daughter chose a career that takes her away from family, that involves violence and conflict." His words were delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never examined his own assumptions or considered that his definition of contribution might be limited and self-serving. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't really about the funeral. This was about 20 years of accumulated resentment, 20 years of my family being unable to understand or appreciate the path I'd chosen. They saw my military service as a rejection of their values, when in reality, it was an expression of values they claimed to share but had never actually tested against real challenges. The meeting continued for another hour, with various relatives offering their opinions on how to minimize the military aspects of the service. They spoke about me as if I weren't sitting right there, discussing strategies for downplaying my career as if it were an embarrassing family secret rather than something that should have made them proud. By the time we finally disbanded, I felt hollowed out, diminished in a way that no foreign enemy had ever managed to achieve. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom with its outdated wallpaper and dusty trophies from a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely, I called my aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison. Jim had been with me through 3 deployments and understood better than anyone the challenges of balancing military service with family expectations. "How are you holding up, Colonel?" he asked, his voice warm with genuine concern. "They want me to minimize the military aspects of the service," I told him, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars from my teenage years still clung to the paint. "They think my career is an embarrassment to the family reputation." There was a long pause before Jim responded, and when he did, his voice carried the carefully controlled anger of someone who had seen too many good officers undermined by people who had never understood the sacrifices military service required. "Would you like me to coordinate with the local honor guard for the service? I know you haven't asked for anything formal, but the regional commander specifically mentioned that they'd be honored to participate if you wanted them there." I considered the offer, weighing it against the family drama it would inevitably create. "No," I said finally. "Let's keep it simple. They've made it clear what kind of service they want, and I don't need to create more conflict while we're supposed to be grieving." But even as I said the words, I felt a deep sadness that had nothing to do with my mother's passing and everything to do with the realization that my own family had never seen me clearly enough to understand what they were asking me to hide. They had created a version of me that fit their narrative, and they were so invested in that version that they couldn't see the person I'd actually become. The morning of the funeral, I put on my dress uniform, not because my family wanted me to, but because it felt like the most honest way to honor my mother's memory. The woman who had raised me, whatever her later reservations about my career choices, had been the one who taught me the importance of integrity and service to something larger than myself. If I was going to say goodbye to her, I was going to do it as the person those values had helped me become. When I walked into the funeral home, I could feel the immediate tension my appearance created. My family had clearly been hoping I would choose civilian clothes, something that would allow them to present a more conventional image to the assembled mourners. Instead, I appeared in the full dress uniform of a United States Army colonel, complete with ribbons and decorations that represented years of distinguished service in some of the world's most challenging environments. Marcus approached me with barely concealed frustration. "Sarah," he hissed under his breath, We discussed this. You're making this about you instead of about Mom. I looked at him steadily, noting how he instinctively stepped back slightly when confronted with the authority that my uniform represented. I'm honoring the woman who taught me the values that led me to this career, I replied quietly. If you're embarrassed by that, the problem isn't with me. The service began with all the careful orchestration my family had planned. The pastor, clearly briefed on the family's preferences, focused on my mother's community involvement, her charity work, and her role as a devoted wife and mother. There were no mentions of military service, no references to the daughter whose career had taken her around the world in service of her country. I sat in the front pew, surrounded by family members who seemed determined to pretend that the most defining aspect of my adult life simply didn't exist. But as the service progressed, I began to notice something my family had missed in their careful planning. Throughout the chapel, scattered among the family friends and community members, were men and women whose bearing and posture spoke of military training. Some were in civilian clothes, but others wore the dress uniforms of various branches of service. I recognized a few faces from my time in Washington, colleagues who had somehow learned of the service and chosen to attend. My family, focused on their own carefully controlled narrative, seemed oblivious to the growing military presence in the chapel. They had been so concerned with minimizing my career that they had failed to notice that representatives of that career were quietly filling their carefully planned memorial service. It was then that Marcus rose to deliver his eulogy, the speech he had been crafting for days to present the perfect image of family respectability. He spoke beautifully about my mother's contributions to the community, her charity work, and her devotion to family. But as his speech progressed, I could see him building toward the moment he had been planning, the subtle criticism disguised as loving concern that would establish the family narrative about my choices. Mom worried about all of us, but especially about those of us who chose paths that took us far from home, he said, his eyes finding mine in the audience. She understood that some people are called to service, but she also believed that the most important service we can provide is to our own families, our own communities. She worried that in trying to save the world, some of us might lose sight of the people who loved us most. His words were delivered with the skill of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of public criticism disguised as familial love. He was painting me as selfish, as someone who had chosen duty over family, service over love. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, designed to establish once and for all that my military career represented a failure of priorities rather than a fulfillment of the values my mother had actually taught me. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the familiar sting of being reduced to a cautionary tale in my own mother's eulogy. Around me, I could sense the growing tension from the military personnel who were witnessing this character assassination of a fellow officer. But I remained composed, drawing on 20 years of training in maintaining dignity under fire. Marcus was building to his conclusion, the final stroke that would cement his narrative, when something unexpected happened. The chapel door opened, and a figure in dress blues entered with the measured precision that only comes from years of military bearing. Then another, and another. What my family had failed to realize in their careful planning was that word of the service had reached my professional community through channels they didn't understand and couldn't control. The men and women entering the chapel weren't just random mourners. They were representatives of every major command I had served with, officers whose respect I had earned through competence and dedication, colleagues who understood better than my own family what my service had meant and what it had cost. But the moment that changed everything came when the chapel door opened one final time, and a figure entered who commanded immediate attention from every person in military dress. General Patricia Hawkins, the first female 4-star general in Army history, walked down the center aisle with the bearing that comes from a lifetime of breaking barriers and exceeding expectations. The general's presence sent a visible ripple through the military personnel scattered throughout the chapel, all of whom recognized one of the most respected leaders in the modern military. But for my family, still focused on Marcus's speech, she was just another unexpected guest whose significance they couldn't comprehend. Marcus, sensing the distraction, but not understanding its source, tried to regain control of his narrative. As I was saying, he continued, his voice slightly strained, Mom understood that true service begins at home, with the people who depend on us most. She hoped that someday her children would understand that the greatest honor comes not from distant adventures, but from being present for the people who love us. It was then that General Hawkins did something that would forever change how my family understood my place in the world. She rose from her seat in the back of the chapel, and in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect on battlefields and in boardrooms around the world, she said, "Excuse me." The entire chapel fell silent. Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open, his carefully planned speech dying in his throat. Every head turned toward the general, whose presence seemed to fill the entire space with the weight of unquestioned authority. "I apologize," General Hawkins continued, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent chapel, "but I couldn't allow this service to continue without ensuring that everyone here understands exactly who we are honoring today." She paused, her eyes scanning the room with the tactical assessment skills that had made her a legend in military circles. "I have had the privilege of serving alongside Colonel Sarah Chen for over a decade," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have watched her develop strategies that prevented conflicts, coordinate responses that saved lives, and demonstrate the kind of moral courage that defines the very best of military leadership. She is one of the finest officers I have ever had the honor to serve with, and her contributions to our national security are beyond measure." The silence in the chapel was absolute. My family sat frozen, their carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time as one of the most powerful women in the military establishment methodically dismantled their attempts to diminish my service. But General Hawkins wasn't finished. Colonel Chen's mother clearly raised a daughter who understood that true service requires sacrifice, that real honor comes from dedicating your life to something larger than yourself. Any family would be proud to claim such a daughter. Any community would be honored to call her their own. She looked directly at Marcus, who had gone pale as he began to understand that he had just publicly criticized someone whose professional reputation was defended by generals. The fact that some people in this room seem unaware of Colonel Chen's distinguished record of service is unfortunate, but it doesn't diminish the respect she has earned from those who understand the true meaning of honor and sacrifice. In that moment, 20 years of being treated as a disappointment by my own family was suddenly and permanently reversed by someone who actually understood what I had dedicated my life to achieving. The general's words didn't just defend my career, they revealed the fundamental ignorance that had shaped my family's treatment of me for decades. Marcus tried to recover, to somehow regain control of his eulogy, but the damage was complete. The narrative he had spent years constructing, the story of the wayward daughter who had chosen poorly, had been exposed as the petty fiction of people who had never bothered to understand what they were criticizing. As General Hawkins returned to her seat, I looked around the chapel and finally saw myself reflected in the eyes of people who understood what my service meant. The military personnel scattered throughout the room were looking at me not with pity or concern, but with the respect accorded to a fellow warrior who had earned her place through competence and dedication. For the first time in 20 years, I was being seen clearly by people who mattered, and what they saw was not a disappointment or a cautionary tale, but a successful officer whose service had made a difference in ways my family had never bothered to learn about. The silence following General Hawkins' intervention stretched like a taut wire about to snap. I could feel the weight of every gaze in that chapel, the collective held breath of a room full of people trying to process what had just happened. Marcus stood at the podium, his face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and growing panic as he realized that his carefully orchestrated character assassination had just been obliterated by someone whose authority was unquestionable. But what happened next revealed just how deeply my family's misunderstanding of my life ran. Instead of recognizing the magnitude of what had just occurred, instead of understanding that a 4-star general had just publicly defended my service record, Robert slowly stood up from his seat in the front row. His face was flushed with the kind of righteous indignation that comes from having your worldview challenged by inconvenient facts. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying across the chapel with the pompous authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "But this is a private family service for my wife. I don't know who you think you are, but you have no right to interrupt our son's eulogy with your political statements. The collective intake of breath from the military personnel in the room was audible. Robert had just told a four-star general that she had no right to speak at my mother's funeral, had just dismissed her defense of my service as political theater. He had no idea that he was currently addressing one of the most powerful women in the United States military, a person whose decisions could affect global policy and whose respect was sought by world leaders. General Hawkins regarded Robert with the kind of calm patience typically reserved for dealing with particularly obstinate foreign dignitaries. She remained seated, her posture perfect, her expression neutral, but I could see in her eyes the calculating assessment of someone deciding exactly how much education this civilian needed. "I am General Patricia Hawkins," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that makes people instinctively straighten their shoulders. "I serve as Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Army. I am here to pay my respects to the mother of one of our most distinguished officers, and to ensure that Colonel Chen receives the honor she has earned through 20 years of exemplary service to this nation." The title hung in the air like a revelation. Colonel, not captain, as my family had always referred to me, not the vague military situation they had spent years being embarrassed by. Colonel Sarah Chen, a rank that represented 2 decades of progressive responsibility, leadership, and achievement in one of the world's most demanding professions. I watched my family's faces as they processed this information. Linda's mouth fell open in a perfect circle of surprise. Marcus gripped the podium as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Robert's expression shifted from indignation to confusion to something that might have been the beginning of comprehension, though he clearly still didn't understand the full implications of what he was hearing. But it was my stepfather's next words that revealed just how fundamentally they had misunderstood my career. "That's impossible," he said, his voice weaker now, but still carrying traces of his earlier authority. "Sarah is a captain. She's been a captain for years. We would know if she had been promoted." The sound that came from several of the military personnel in the room was barely contained laughter, the kind of response that comes from hearing someone confidently state something so wrong it borders on absurd. General Hawkins' eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign of her surprise at encountering ignorance so complete. "Sir," she said, her voice now carrying just a hint of the steel that had made her legendary in military circles, "Colonel Chen achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel 8 years ago and was promoted to full colonel 3 years ago. These are not recent developments. They represent a consistent pattern of exceptional performance and leadership that has been recognized at the highest levels of military command." She paused, letting this information settle over a room full of people who were beginning to realize that they had been operating under fundamentally false assumptions about my career. The last time Colonel Chen held the rank of captain was over a decade ago. If you were unaware of her promotions, that speaks to a lack of communication, not a lack of achievement. I felt something shifting inside me as I listened to this exchange, something that had been buried under years of accepting my family's diminished version of my accomplishments. For the first time in decades, someone was forcing them to confront the reality of who I had become, not the limited version they had constructed to fit their own comfort level. Marcus, apparently deciding that retreat was his best option, mumbled something about continuing the service and began gathering his notes. But General Hawkins wasn't finished. She rose from her seat with the fluid grace that comes from years of command presence, and when she spoke again, her voice carried to every corner of the chapel. "If I may," she said, though it wasn't really a request, "I would like to share some context about Colonel Chen's service that might help this community understand exactly what kind of person you are honoring today." The chapel fell silent again, but this time the silence felt expectant rather than uncomfortable. Even the family members who had spent the morning trying to minimize my military career seemed to sense that they were about to learn something important. Colonel Chen spent her first deployment in Afghanistan developing intelligence protocols that are still used today to protect forward operating bases, General Hawkins began, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering an official briefing. Her analysis prevented 17 separate attacks on coalition forces, saving an estimated 237 American lives.
I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from grief, but from the overwhelming experience of having someone understand and articulate the work I had done in places my family couldn't even locate on a map. These weren't abstract accomplishments or bureaucratic achievements. These were real missions with real consequences, work that had mattered in ways my family had never bothered to learn about. During her second deployment, the general continued, Colonel Chen was instrumental in establishing humanitarian corridors that allowed the evacuation of over 3,000 civilians from combat zones. She coordinated with international agencies, local governments, and military forces from 7 different nations to execute one of the most successful civilian protection operations in recent military history. Around the chapel, I could see people leaning forward, their faces reflecting growing respect and amazement. These were the same community members who had been nodding along with Marcus's subtle criticisms just minutes earlier, the same people who had accepted the family narrative that my military career was somehow problematic or embarrassing. Her third deployment took her to the Pentagon, where she developed strategic assessments that informed policy decisions at the highest levels of government, General Hawkins continued. Her recommendations have shaped our approach to international relations in 3 separate regional conflicts, and her expertise is regularly sought by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I realized that tears were now flowing freely down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from the profound relief of finally being seen clearly by people who had spent years looking at me through a distorted lens. This was my life, my work, my contribution to the world, and for the first time in decades, my own community was hearing about it in terms that reflected its actual significance. Currently, Colonel Chen serves as Senior Strategic Advisor for Pacific Command, a position that requires the highest security clearance and places her among the most trusted officers in the United States military. She is responsible for assessments that affect the security of the entire Pacific region, including the protection of over 60 million American citizens. The general paused, her eyes scanning the faces of my family members, all of whom now looked as if they were hearing about a stranger rather than someone they had known their entire lives. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of personal pride that made my chest tight with emotion. I have worked with heads of state, Nobel Prize winners, and some of the most brilliant minds in international relations, she said. Colonel Sarah Chen ranks among the most capable, dedicated, and effective officers I have ever had the privilege to serve alongside. Any nation would be proud to claim her service. Any family should be honored to call her their own. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had marked the earlier part of the service. This was the silence of people trying to reconcile what they had just learned with the assumptions they had carried for years. I could see my relatives looking at me with new eyes, as if they were seeing me for the first time. Marcus, who had spent his entire eulogy building toward a subtle condemnation of my life choices, now faced the impossible task of continuing his speech after having his central premise demolished by someone whose expertise was unquestionable. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat several times, and finally managed to mumble a few closing remarks that bore no resemblance to the triumphant conclusion he had planned. But the transformation in the chapel's atmosphere was only beginning. As Marcus stepped away from the podium, I noticed movement throughout the room. The military personnel who had been scattered among the civilian mourners were rising to their feet, not in any coordinated way, but in the organic response of people who recognize a moment that demands acknowledgement. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, my aide-de-camp, was the first to speak. He had been sitting in the back of the chapel, having flown in from Washington when he learned of the service. His presence alone should have told my family something about my standing in the military community, but they had been too focused on their own narrative to notice. Colonel Chen saved my life in Kandahar, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She identified a pattern in insurgent communications that revealed a planned attack on our convoy route. When she couldn't reach us through normal channels, she personally commandeered a helicopter to intercept our patrol. That was 7 years ago. I wouldn't be here today without her analytical skills and her willingness to take personal risks to protect her fellow soldiers. Another voice came from the middle of the chapel. Major Rebecca Santos, who I recognized from my time at Central Command, stood and addressed the room with the same calm professionalism she brought to intelligence briefings. Colonel Chen's strategic assessments guided the humanitarian mission I led in Syria. Her analysis of local political dynamics allowed us to establish refugee camps in locations that remained secure for over 2 years. Thousands of families were able to escape conflict because she understood the human terrain better than anyone else in the region. What was happening was unprecedented in my experience. Military personnel don't typically speak at civilian funerals, don't usually transform memorial services into testimonials about professional achievements. But something about my family's attempt to diminish my service had triggered a response from people who understood what that service actually meant. Commander David Park, a Navy officer I had worked with on joint operations, rose from his seat near the front of the chapel. The intelligence package Colonel Chen developed for our maritime interdiction operations resulted in the seizure of over $3 million worth of narcotics and the disruption of trafficking networks that were funding terrorist operations. Her work doesn't just protect American soldiers, it protects American communities from the drugs and violence that these networks bring to our shores. I sat in stunned silence as colleague after colleague stood to share stories about missions I had never discussed with my family, operations whose success had depended on analysis and planning that my relatives had dismissed as bureaucratic busywork. Each testimony revealed another layer of my professional life that had been invisible to people who had never bothered to ask what I actually did for a living. Colonel Maria Vasquez, one of the few other women to achieve senior rank in Army intelligence, spoke about a counterterrorism operation where my cultural analysis had prevented a diplomatic incident that could have destabilized an entire region.
Captain Thomas Wright described how my logistical planning had enabled the successful evacuation of American civilians from a conflict zone during a government collapse. With each testimony, I could see my family's understanding of my life shifting in real time. Robert's face had gone from indignation to confusion to something approaching awe as he began to comprehend that his stepdaughter wasn't just a soldier, but someone whose expertise was sought by the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Linda, who had spent the morning expressing concern about how my military situation might reflect on the family reputation, now looked as if she were trying to process the possibility that having a colonel in the family might actually be something to boast about rather than hide. But it was Marcus who seemed most affected by what he was hearing. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the dawning realization that his eulogy had just publicly criticized someone whose professional accomplishments far exceeded anything he had achieved in his comfortable real estate career. The testimonials might have continued indefinitely, but General Hawkins raised her hand in a subtle gesture that immediately commanded attention from every military person in the room. The spontaneous tribute stopped, and she rose once again to address the chapel. "I think," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of the most respected leaders in the modern military, "that we have established the caliber of officer we are honoring today. Colonel Chen's service record speaks for itself, as do the testimonies of the men and women whose lives have been touched by her dedication and expertise." She turned to look directly at me, her expression softening slightly from the commanding presence she had maintained throughout the confrontation with my family. "Colonel," she said, "your mother raised a daughter who understands the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and honor. These are not abstract concepts, but principles that have guided every day of your career and every decision you have made in service to your country." The general's words hit me with unexpected force. For 20 years, I had internalized my family's narrative that my military career represented a rejection of the values my mother had tried to instill in me. I had allowed their disapproval to make me question whether I had somehow failed as a daughter by choosing duty over their expectations. But General Hawkins was reframing my entire life story. She was suggesting that my military service wasn't a departure from my mother's teachings, but their ultimate expression. That the values of integrity, dedication, and service to something greater than oneself that my mother had modeled throughout her life had found their truest expression in my commitment to protecting others. "Your mother would be proud," the general continued, her voice now carrying a warmth that hadn't been present during her earlier corrections of my family's misconceptions. "She raised a daughter who has spent her entire adult life working to make the world safer for people she will never meet, in places most people will never see. That is the definition of selfless service, and it is an honor to serve alongside such an officer."
The chapel fell silent once more, but this time the silence felt reverent rather than uncomfortable. I could sense that something fundamental had shifted in how everyone in that room understood my place in the world, including how I understood it myself. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the disappointing daughter who had chosen poorly. I wasn't the family member whose career needed to be minimized or hidden. I was Colonel Sarah Chen, a distinguished officer whose service had made a measurable difference in the world, whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of government, whose dedication had literally saved lives. The remainder of the service passed in a blur of changed dynamics and shifted perceptions. When the time came for final respects, the military personnel in the chapel formed an impromptu honor guard, their bearing and precision creating a ceremony far more impressive than anything my family had planned. They moved with the synchronized discipline that comes from years of training and shared purpose, transforming my mother's funeral into a demonstration of the respect I had earned in the world that actually mattered. As we filed out of the chapel, I found myself surrounded by colleagues and fellow officers whose presence had turned what was supposed to be a minimized, carefully controlled service into a celebration of military excellence. General Hawkins walked beside me, her presence alone elevating the entire proceeding to a level of significance my family had never imagined possible. Outside the chapel, as people milled around offering condolences and sharing memories, I overheard conversations that revealed just how completely the mourning had transformed everyone's understanding of the situation. Community members who had arrived expecting to comfort a family grieving the loss of their matriarch were now discussing the remarkable discovery that they had been living alongside a distinguished military leader without ever knowing it. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 houses down from my childhood home, approached me with the kind of awed respect typically reserved for celebrities. "Colonel Chen," she said, using my proper title for the first time in the 20 years she had known me, "I had no idea about your service. My grandson is thinking about joining the military, and I wonder if I could ask you some questions about what that path might look like for him." Similar conversations were happening throughout the crowd. People who had known me as Robert's stepdaughter, the quiet one who was always away on some kind of military assignment, were suddenly seeing me as a resource, an expert, someone whose opinions and advice carried weight and authority. But the most significant conversation happened when Marcus approached me as the crowd began to thin. His earlier confidence had been completely replaced by obvious discomfort and what appeared to be genuine remorse. His carefully styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his expensive suit somehow looked less impressive than it had that morning. "Sarah," he said, his voice lacking any of the authority he had wielded during the morning's planning session, "I need to apologize. I had no idea about your actual rank or your accomplishments. When you said you were in the military, I just assumed." He trailed off, apparently realizing that explaining his assumptions would only make the situation worse. The truth was that Marcus, like the rest of my family, had never bothered to learn the details of my career because they had decided early on that those details weren't worth knowing. They had created a simplified version of my life that fit their preconceptions and had never questioned whether that version bore any resemblance to reality. I looked at my stepbrother, this man who had spent the morning trying to publicly diminish my life's work in service of his own image management, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not triumph, but a kind of sad clarity about the relationship we had never actually had. "Marcus," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "the problem isn't that you didn't know my rank. The problem is that you never asked. For 20 years, you've had opinions about my career without ever bothering to learn what that career actually involved. You've been embarrassed by something you never understood." His face flushed with what I hoped was shame rather than continued defensiveness. "But what could I say?" he asked, his voice taking on a plaintive quality that made him sound younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. "You never talked about your work. You never explained what you were doing overseas." "That's because most of what I do is classified," I replied, feeling the familiar frustration of trying to explain the constraints of military service to people who had no framework for understanding them. "I can't discuss specific operations or share details about intelligence assessments. But I could have talked about the broader mission, about the purpose of the work, about why it mattered. You never seemed interested in hearing about any of it." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Marcus asking questions that revealed just how little he had understood about my life and career. He seemed genuinely surprised to learn that I regularly briefed general officers, that my assessments influenced policy decisions, that I held a security clearance that allowed me access to some of the most sensitive intelligence in the world. But what struck me most about our exchange was how his surprise revealed the fundamental assumptions that had shaped his treatment of me for decades. He had assumed that military service, especially for women, was somehow less prestigious than civilian careers. He had assumed that my quiet demeanor about my work reflected lack of achievement rather than professional discretion. He had assumed that his success in real estate represented a more valuable contribution to society than my work in national security. As our conversation wound down, Marcus made what appeared to be a genuine attempt at reconciliation. "Sarah, I hope you can forgive me for this morning. If I had known about your actual accomplishments, I never would have said those things in the eulogy. I'm proud to have you as a sister, and I want everyone to know about your success." I appreciated the gesture, but it also highlighted another aspect of my family's fundamental misunderstanding of my motivations. They seemed to think that my hurt feelings were about recognition, about wanting them to boast about my achievements or brag about my rank to their friends. But that had never been what I needed from them. "Marcus," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I don't need you to boast about my career. I don't need you to tell your friends about my rank or my security clearance. What I needed was for you to respect that my choices were valid, even if you didn't understand them. What I needed was for you to trust that I was capable of making good decisions about my own life, even if those decisions didn't match your expectations." He nodded, but I could see in his expression that he was still processing the idea that my military career wasn't just a more impressive version of what he had thought it was, but an entirely different category of service that operated according to principles he had never considered. As the afternoon wore on and people began to leave, I found myself in conversations with military colleagues who had traveled significant distances to attend the service. Their presence wasn't just professional courtesy. These were people who had worked closely with me, who understood the challenges and sacrifices that military service requires, who had seen me perform under pressure in situations where the stakes were measured in human lives. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison pulled me aside as he prepared to return to Washington. "Colonel," he said, his voice carrying the respect that had been absent from every family interaction that morning, "I want you to know that what happened here today doesn't diminish your service or your reputation in any way. Your family's lack of understanding reflects their limitations, not yours." His words were a kindness I hadn't realized I needed. For 20 years, I had internalized the idea that my family's disapproval meant I was somehow failing to balance my professional and personal responsibilities. I had accepted that their inability to understand my career meant I was poor at explaining it, that their embarrassment about my choices meant those choices were somehow wrong. But the events of that morning had revealed a different possibility. Maybe the problem wasn't with my choices or my communication skills. Maybe the problem was with people who had decided that anything they couldn't immediately understand must be less valuable than things they could. General Hawkins was among the last to leave, and her final words to me carried the weight of someone who had navigated similar challenges throughout her own groundbreaking career. "Colonel Chen," she said, her voice warm with genuine affection, "never let anyone make you smaller to accommodate their comfort level. Your service matters. Your expertise matters. You matter." As I watched her walk away, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in how I understood my place in the world. For the first time in decades, I had been seen clearly by the people who mattered, and what they had seen was not a disappointment or a cautionary tale, but a successful officer whose contributions were valued and respected. The drive back to my hotel that evening took me through the neighborhoods where I had grown up, past the schools where I had first learned about service and sacrifice, past the places where I had dreamed about making a difference in the world. But for the first time in years, those familiar streets didn't feel like a reminder of disappointment or unfulfilled expectations. They felt like the foundation of a life that had ultimately succeeded in ways that truly mattered. That night, alone in my hotel room, I finally allowed myself to fully process what had happened at my mother's funeral. My family had tried to minimize my military career, to reduce 20 years of distinguished service to an embarrassing family situation that needed to be managed rather than celebrated. Instead, they had inadvertently created a forum where my actual accomplishments were revealed and honored by people whose opinions carried real weight. The irony was almost too perfect. In trying to protect their reputation from association with my military situation, they had discovered that my military career was something that enhanced rather than diminished any family standing. In attempting to minimize my service, they had learned that my service was more significant than they had ever imagined possible. But more importantly, I had finally been forced to confront the extent to which I had allowed their limited understanding to shape my own sense of worth. I had spent years accepting their narrative that my military career represented a failure to live up to expectations, when in reality, it represented the successful pursuit of a calling that had made a measurable difference in the world. The woman who went to sleep that night was fundamentally different from the one who had woken up that morning.
She was Colonel Sarah Chen, a distinguished officer whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of government, whose service had saved lives and protected communities, whose dedication had earned the respect of generals and the gratitude of fellow soldiers. And for the first time in 20 years, that was enough. 3 months after my mother's funeral, I stood before a classroom full of cadets at the United States Military Academy at West Point. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across rows of young faces that looked back at me with the kind of focused attention that only comes from genuine respect for the person speaking. These weren't students humoring a guest lecturer or sitting through mandatory instruction. These were future officers who understood that the woman at the front of their classroom had earned her place through competence and dedication. Today, we're discussing strategic intelligence analysis in asymmetric warfare environments, I began, my voice carrying the authority that comes from years of actual experience in the field. The principles we'll cover aren't theoretical exercises. They're methodologies that have been tested in real operations, refined through practical application, and proven effective in protecting American lives and interests around the world. The cadets leaned forward, notebooks open, pens poised to capture insights from someone who had actually applied these concepts in situations where failure could have catastrophic consequences. This was knowledge earned through sleepless nights in classified briefing rooms, through tense hours analyzing intelligence that would guide military operations, through the accumulated experience of someone who had spent 2 decades serving at the intersection of strategy and national security. The intelligence officer's primary responsibility isn't just to gather information, I continued, clicking to a slide that showed a complex network analysis diagram. It's to identify patterns that others miss, to see connections that aren't immediately obvious, and to provide assessments that enable decision-makers to act with confidence even in uncertain situations. One cadet raised her hand, a young woman whose bearing suggested she was already thinking like an officer. Colonel Chen, she asked, how do you maintain objectivity when analyzing threats that could directly impact people you know and work with? It was the kind of question that revealed real understanding of the psychological challenges inherent in intelligence work. The answer required more than textbook theory. It required sharing the hard-won wisdom that comes from years of making assessments where personal feelings could compromise professional judgment. That's one of the most important skills an intelligence officer develops, I replied, drawing on countless experiences where emotional detachment had been essential to accurate analysis. You learn to compartmentalize personal concerns while maintaining empathy for the human consequences of your recommendations. It's not about becoming callous, it's about developing the discipline to let your analysis be guided by evidence rather than emotion. The discussion that followed was exactly the kind of intellectual engagement I had missed during years of family gatherings where my expertise was dismissed or ignored. These cadets asked probing questions about methodology, challenged assumptions in ways that revealed sophisticated understanding, and pushed me to articulate concepts that I had internalized through experience but rarely had the opportunity to teach. After the class ended, several cadets approached me with questions that went beyond the formal curriculum. They wanted to understand what it was like to be a woman in military intelligence, how to navigate the challenges of building credibility in a male-dominated field, what it meant to serve in roles where your contributions might never be publicly acknowledged.
Colonel Chen, one cadet said, her voice carrying the determination that would serve her well in her future career, I want to specialize in strategic intelligence after graduation. What advice would you give someone just starting in this field? I looked at this young woman, seeing something of myself at her age, remembering the combination of ambition and uncertainty that had driven me to pursue a career path that few people understood or appreciated. The advice I gave her was born from 20 years of learning to find validation from professional excellence rather than family approval. Focus on becoming genuinely expert at something that matters, I told her. Don't worry about whether other people understand the value of your work. Don't spend energy trying to convince people who aren't interested in learning. Pour your effort into mastering your craft and serving alongside people who share your commitment to excellence. The conversation reminded me of how profoundly my relationship with my own purpose had changed since the funeral. For years, I had allowed my family's lack of understanding to create doubt about whether my career choices were worthwhile. I had internalized their questions about why I had chosen service over conventional success, why I had prioritized duty over their expectations, why I continued pursuing a path they couldn't appreciate. But standing in that classroom, sharing knowledge with future officers who valued expertise and understood sacrifice, I realized that those doubts had been misplaced. The problem had never with my choices. The problem had been with seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. That weekend, I returned to my apartment in Washington, a space that reflected the life I had built around my military career. The walls were decorated with commendations and photographs from deployments, reminders of missions accomplished and relationships forged in service to something greater than personal advancement. This was a home that told the story of a life dedicated to purpose rather than profit, to contribution rather than accumulation. It was Saturday afternoon when my phone rang with a call I hadn't expected. The caller ID showed Marcus's number, the first time my stepbrother had attempted to contact me since the funeral. I hesitated before answering, uncertain whether I was ready for whatever conversation he was hoping to initiate. "Sarah," he said when I picked up, his voice carrying none of the confidence I had grown accustomed to hearing from him. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to talk about what happened at Mom's funeral and about some things I've learned since then." His tone was different from any I could remember in our adult relationship. Gone was the condescending authority, the subtle dismissiveness that had characterized most of our interactions over the years. He sounded uncertain, almost vulnerable, like someone who had discovered that fundamental assumptions about the world were wrong. "I've been doing some research," he continued, the admission seeming to cost him some effort. "After what General Hawkins said at the service, I realized I didn't really understand what your career involved. I looked up some information about military ranks, about what colonels actually do, about the kind of responsibilities you must have." The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. Marcus asked questions about my work that revealed he was finally making an effort to understand what I had been doing for the past 2 decades. He wanted to know about my deployments, about the nature of strategic intelligence work, about what it meant to hold the kind of security clearance that allowed access to classified information. What surprised me most was his genuine shock as he began to comprehend the scope and significance of my responsibilities. He had somehow imagined that military service, especially for women, was primarily ceremonial or administrative. The idea that I was regularly briefing general officers, that my assessments influenced policy decisions, that I held positions of significant authority and responsibility seemed to genuinely amaze him. "Sarah," he said at one point, his voice carrying what sounded like real remorse, "I owe you a much bigger apology than I gave you at the funeral. I didn't just misunderstand your rank or your accomplishments. I completely failed to recognize that you had built an entire career around expertise and leadership that I never bothered to learn about." The apology was more comprehensive than I had expected, but it also highlighted something that had become clear to me in the months since the funeral. The problem hadn't been Marcus's ignorance about military structure or his lack of understanding about my specific role. The problem had been his assumption that anything he didn't immediately comprehend must be less important than things he did understand. "Marcus," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I appreciate the apology, and I'm glad you're making an effort to understand my career. But I need you to know that the hurt wasn't really about recognition or appreciation. It was about respect for my choices, even when you didn't understand them." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Marcus asking questions that revealed just how much about my life he had never bothered to explore. He seemed particularly surprised to learn that I regularly worked with international partners, that my expertise was sought by civilian agencies as well as military commands, that my career had provided opportunities to travel and serve in ways that had enriched my understanding of the world. Near the end of our call, Marcus asked a question that suggested he was beginning to understand the broader implications of what he had learned. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been pride, "would it be appropriate for me to mention your rank and your service when I talk about family with my colleagues and friends? I realize I've spent years not knowing how to talk about what you do, but now I'd like people to know that my sister is a distinguished military officer." The offer was well-intentioned, but it also revealed that Marcus was still thinking about my career primarily in terms of how it reflected on him rather than what it meant to me. He wanted to claim credit for being related to someone successful rather than simply respecting the path I had chosen for its own merits. "I'd rather you mention my service only if it's relevant to the conversation," I told him. "I don't need you to boast about my rank to enhance your own standing. What I needed, and what I hope we can have going forward, is a relationship where you respect my choices even when they don't match your expectations." After we hung up, I reflected on how the conversation represented both progress and limitation. Marcus was making an effort to understand and appreciate my career, which was more than he had done in 20 years. But his focus was still primarily on external recognition rather than genuine comprehension of what military service meant or why I had found it fulfilling. The following Monday, I returned to my regular duties at the Pentagon, where the events at my mother's funeral had become something of a legend among my colleagues. General Hawkins had apparently shared the story of having to educate my family about my actual rank and accomplishments, and it had resonated with other officers who had experienced similar challenges in having their service understood and respected by civilian family members. "Colonel Chen," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison said when he briefed me on the week's schedule, "I've had 3 separate colleagues ask me for advice on handling family members who don't understand their military careers. Apparently, your funeral experience has become a cautionary tale about the importance of communication between military families and their civilian relatives." The idea that my personal struggle had somehow become instructive for others was both gratifying and sobering. It suggested that the disconnect between military service and civilian understanding was more widespread than I had realized, that other officers were dealing with similar challenges in having their careers valued and respected by people who should have been their strongest supporters. That week, I received an invitation that would have been unimaginable during the years when I was allowing my family's limited understanding to define my sense of professional worth. The Defense Department was hosting a conference on women in military leadership, and they had asked me to deliver the keynote address to an audience of senior officers, defense officials, and policymakers. The speech I prepared focused on the importance of supporting military families, but from a perspective that acknowledged the challenges faced by service members whose contributions weren't fully understood or appreciated by their civilian relatives. I drew on my own experience to illustrate how family dynamics could either support or undermine military careers, particularly for women who were already navigating the challenges of serving in traditionally male-dominated fields. Military service requires sacrifice, not just from service members, but from their entire families, I told the assembled audience, which included several general officers and the Secretary of Defense. But those sacrifices are most sustainable when they're made in service of something that families understand and value. When family members don't comprehend the significance of military service, they can inadvertently undermine the very people they should be supporting. The response to my speech was overwhelmingly positive, with several attendees approaching me afterward to share their own experiences with family misunderstanding or lack of support. It became clear that my situation, while particularly dramatic in its resolution, was representative of a broader challenge facing many military families. One general's wife, herself a retired officer, pulled me aside after the event. "Colonel Chen," she said, her voice warm with understanding, "your story at your mother's funeral has been shared throughout the military spouse community. You've given voice to something many of us have experienced but didn't know how to articulate." The conversation that followed revealed that the challenge of having military service understood and valued by civilian family members was particularly acute for women, who often faced additional scrutiny about whether their career choices conflicted with traditional family roles. Many had experienced subtle or overt criticism from relatives who questioned their priorities or suggested that military service was somehow incompatible with being a good daughter, sister, or mother. In the weeks that followed, I began receiving invitations to speak at other military events, to serve on panels addressing family support issues, and to contribute to discussions about improving civilian understanding of military service. What had begun as a personal struggle with family dynamics had evolved into a broader platform for addressing systemic challenges in how military careers are perceived and valued. The transformation in my own family relationships continued to evolve as well. Robert, my stepfather, made his own effort to understand my career, though his approach was characteristically methodical and somewhat formal. He researched military rank structure, read articles about women in the military, and even attended a Veterans Day ceremony of the local VA hospital to better understand military culture. His outreach was awkward but genuine. He called one evening to ask questions about my security clearance, having apparently learned that it represented a significant level of trust and responsibility. The conversation was stilted and formal, but it represented more effort to understand my career than he had made in the previous 2 decades. "Sarah," he said near the end of our call, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished."
I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what your service meant, and I regret that we didn't do a better job of supporting you over the years. The apology was appreciated, though it also highlighted how much time had been lost to misunderstanding and misplaced priorities. Still, it suggested that relationships could evolve, that people could learn to see beyond their initial assumptions if they were willing to make the effort. But it was a conversation with my Aunt Linda that provided the most surprising development in my family relationships. She called on a Thursday evening, her voice carrying an emotion I had never heard from her before. "Sarah," she said without preamble, "I need to apologize to you, and I need to ask for your help. My grandson David is considering joining the military after he graduates from high school, and I realize I have no idea how to advise him or support him in that decision." The conversation that followed revealed how completely my family's perspective on military service had been transformed by the events at the funeral. Linda, who had spent years expressing concern about how my military situation might reflect on the family reputation, was now seeking my expertise and guidance for her own grandson's potential military career. I found myself in the unexpected position of being consulted as the family expert on military service, asked to explain everything from basic training to career progression to the benefits and challenges of military life. It was gratifying to finally be valued for my expertise, but it was also somewhat surreal to be providing guidance to family members who had spent decades dismissing the very knowledge they were now seeking. The most significant change, however, was in my own relationship with my sense of purpose and professional identity. The validation I had received from General Hawkins and my military colleagues had fundamentally shifted how I understood my place in the world. I no longer needed approval from people who couldn't or wouldn't understand my choices. I had learned to derive satisfaction from the work itself, and from the respect of people whose opinions were informed by actual understanding of what military service required and accomplished. 6 months after the funeral, I received news that represented the culmination of 20 years of dedicated service. I was selected for promotion to Brigadier General, a rank achieved by fewer than 1% of military officers and representing recognition at the highest levels of military leadership. The promotion board's comments made it clear that the selection was based not just on my technical expertise, but on my demonstrated ability to bridge military and civilian perspectives, to communicate complex strategic concepts to diverse audiences, and to serve as an advocate for military families facing challenges similar to those I had navigated. When I called to share the news with my family, their responses revealed how completely their understanding of my career had evolved. Marcus, who had once been embarrassed by my military situation, now asked detailed questions about what the promotion meant and expressed genuine pride in having a general for a sister. Robert researched the significance of general officer rank and sent me a card congratulating me on joining what he called the most exclusive leadership club in the world. But the response that meant the most came from an unexpected source. I received a handwritten letter from Mrs. Patterson, my childhood neighbor, who had apparently followed my career developments through community networks. "Dear General Chen," she wrote in careful cursive, "I wanted you to know how proud our entire neighborhood is to have watched you grow into such a distinguished leader. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you became and the service you've provided to our country. You've shown all of us what it means to dedicate your life to something greater than yourself."
The letter captured something that my family had missed for years, but that had finally become clear to them through the events at the funeral. Military service wasn't a rejection of the values my mother had tried to instill in me. It was their ultimate expression, carried out on a scale and with a level of responsibility that honored everything she had taught me about integrity, dedication, and service to others. The evening I received my promotion orders, I sat in my apartment looking through photographs from my military career. Images from deployments, ceremonies, briefings, and training exercises told the story of a life dedicated to purposes larger than personal advancement. These weren't pictures of someone who had failed to live up to expectations. They were documentation of someone who had consistently exceeded them in ways that truly mattered. For 20 years, I had allowed other people's limited understanding to create doubt about whether my choices were worthwhile. I had internalized questions about whether military service was compatible with being a good daughter, whether choosing duty over family expectations represented a character flaw, whether pursuing excellence in a field my relatives couldn't appreciate meant I was somehow selfish or misguided. But the events that began at my mother's funeral had forced me to confront the fundamental fallacy in that thinking. The problem had never been with my choices or my priorities. The problem had been with seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it because they had never bothered to understand what they were being asked to validate. My military career had provided me with opportunities to serve in ways that made measurable differences in the world, to develop expertise that was valued at the highest levels of government, to work alongside people who shared my commitment to excellence and service. It had challenged me intellectually, tested my leadership abilities, and allowed me to contribute to causes that were genuinely important. The respect I had earned from colleagues and superiors wasn't based on family connections or inherited advantages. It was earned through competence, dedication, and results. It came from people who understood what military service required and what it accomplished, people whose opinions were informed by their own experience with the demands and rewards of serving something greater than themselves. As I prepared for the responsibilities that would come with general officer rank, I reflected on how the journey from my mother's funeral to this moment had fundamentally changed my understanding of success and validation. True accomplishment couldn't be diminished by other people's ignorance or enhanced by their belated recognition. It existed independently, measured by the lives touched, the missions accomplished, the standards upheld, and the legacy created through dedicated service. The woman who had sat in that funeral chapel 6 months earlier, absorbing criticism from family members who had never bothered to understand her life's work, had been fundamentally transformed by the experience of being seen clearly by people who mattered. She had learned that respect couldn't be demanded or inherited, only earned through excellence and sustained through integrity. General Sarah Chen would continue serving, but with the confidence that comes from understanding exactly what that service meant and why it mattered, regardless of whether anyone else chose to understand it or not. The validation she needed had been there all along, waiting to be claimed by someone secure enough in her own worth to stop seeking approval from people who were incapable of providing it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.